Okay, David, this time we're gonna get it. We are gonna nail the landing on this jump, and finally got it right. Hey there, how's it going? My name is David and you're watching Kai City RC. Thank you for stopping by. Well, first, I'd like to extend a big heartfelt thank you to everybody that has subscribed to my channel. Early last week, Kai City RC passed 1,000 subscribers. I can hardly believe it. When I started the channel a year and a half ago, it was purely just to share running videos with my family back in England, but I made a few of them public and I got positive responses from people, and it just encouraged me to make more and more of them. And since then it's kind of snowballed, and thank you for everybody that's been commenting and giving me such positive feedback. Normally I've spent most of my life behind the camera, and without your encouragement I don't think I would have ever taken the first steps to coming to this side of the camera. I'm still not very comfortable, but I'm getting better at it. At least I like to think. I guess I'm getting better at it. I'm probably not though. You have no idea how many times it's taken to film this. Anyway, I digress. So a big thank you to everybody that's subscribed and supported the channel. On today's video, we're going to be talking Yokomo YZ-2 Cal 3.1. That is such a long name. The Cal 3.1, it's a high-end two-wheel drive buggy. So if it's not your cup of tea, if it's not really something that interests you, feel free to bail out right now. But if you are interested in a high-end two-wheel drive buggy and my experience as a novice, taking it to the circuit, then stick around, stay tuned, and I'll tell you what I thought of it. Okay, right from the outset, I need to state that this is not going to be a review of the Yokomo YZ-2 Cal 3.1 compared to other two-wheel drive high-end buggies from, Lossy, Associated, X-Ray, etc. I have no experience with those, so I can't comment on how good or bad the Yokomo is compared to other two-wheel drive high-end buggies. So if you're looking for a review on which high-end buggy you should buy, sorry, this isn't a review for you. This is a review of, basically my thoughts on what I think of the Yokomo compared to vintage re-releases from Tamiya and from Kyosho. So the Yokomo YZ-2 Cal 3.1, what do I think? Well, in a word, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Well, I guess that's two words, but you get the idea. It's very, very good, which is kind of obvious, I guess, when you think about it. I mean, the Yokomo has got, 30, 40 years worth of racing development and know-how behind it. So, of course, its performance is far superior to all of my Tamiya and Kyosho buggies. I'll talk a bit more about performance in a moment, but for me, performance wasn't the thing that I noticed most about this buggy. The thing that stood out to me was the Yokomo's durability. It is one tough buggy. Now, price-wise, as I talked about in my previous video, it puts it a similar price range to the four-wheel drive Kyosho re-releases, Optima, Turbo Optima, and it's a slightly cheaper than things like Egress, Avanti. But the parts quality, I would say, is on a par, mostly aluminium, really high quality plastics, etc. But nevertheless, the Yokomo just seems to be way tougher than anything I've driven before. I mean, of course, it's no basher, but the footage you're watching right now, I shot over 2 days at the circuit. So the first day, it was quite busy. There were a lot of people, and I did some racing. I did a little bit of filming, but I didn't want to get in people's way with cameras. Now, on the second day, I was very lucky. I mean, very, very lucky. I got the entire circuit to myself for the entire morning. So I was able to shoot a lot of footage, and I was able to race a lot, and I crashed a lot as well. I really did crash a lot. Now, a lot of those crashes, if they'd had happened in my DTO2, they would have resulted in something breaking. In fact, they did last year when I went to the circuit about half a dozen times. I mean, the layouts changed quite a lot, but invariably I would break something on my DTO2 MS, usually within the first half an hour to an hour, and almost every time just happened to be a part that I didn't have to hand, and so it kind of ended my race day early. And even if I didn't break something would happen during the crash that would mean that I have to go out and fix it. So, you know, turnbuckle steering rod popped off or something like that, shock popped off, or, you know, just minor things, correctable things. But yeah, something would always happen. Yokomo, I broke nothing. Absolutely nothing. The body's taken a few hits, the wings starting to show a bit of wear and tear, but yeah, no damage whatsoever to speak of. So for me, that was like one of the huge benefits, being a novice driver on a short technical course, which is very unforgiving of mistakes. You crash frequently. I didn't need to buy any spare parts. So in one sense, although the Yokomo is a lot more expensive than Tamiya or even Kyosho two-wheel drive, you know, legendary series buggies, since you're spending a lot less money on spare parts, you know, it's not that as expensive. And I think over the long run, you might possibly even save money by buying a high-end buggy. I guess it depends on the circuit you run, how fast you run, how hard you are on your buggies. On the second day, I actually took my Grasshopper. I'm going to talk a bit more about my experience of the circuit in a separate video. I had actually planned to do them all in one video, but it would end up being too long. But on the second day, I took my Grasshopper, and because I was sensible with how I drove it and I didn't try to push it faster than it was capable of, I spent most of the morning running the Grasshopper and broke nothing on that either. So I guess what I'm trying to say is my first few outings with the DTO2 MS, I broke lots of things, but it was more my fault than the buggies. If I'd have driven it within its, you know, limits, then breakages would have been a lot less frequent. Okay, so on to performance. Well, I can't compare the Yokomo's performance to other high-end buggies, but what I can do is compare it to my DTO2 MS, which I drove several times on the same circuit, although the layout has changed quite a lot since I last drove there. I can't really fairly compare it to my other buggies because I've only really driven them outside on dirt, grass, you know, low traction surfaces, and so it wouldn't be really a fair comparison. But what I will say is the Yokomo's performance, yeah, it is orders of magnitude better than the DTO2 MS, as you would expect. You know, it's got so much racing development behind it, and it is supposed to be a high-end racing buggy. Yeah, the performance is off the charts, everyone. Yeah, if you're coming from, like I was, a background of Tamiya and Kyosho, you're going to be blown away by just how well this thing drives. Now, I used to firmly believe that how fast you got around the circuit was as much to do with driver skill it was the buggy you were racing. You know, a pro driver with a, you know, lower spec buggy would probably be quicker around the track than a complete novice with a high-end buggy. I still believe that, but I've got to say, right from the get-go, as soon as I started driving the Yokomo, I was quicker around the circuit than I ever was with my DTO2 MS, and at that point I can say my driver skill was no different. Yeah, so let's start with acceleration first. Now, before I go any further, I have to say I guess I was experiencing the double whammy, because what I mean by that is I was coming from a DTO2 MS with old school electronics. We're talking, the servo in it was basically out of an RTR kit I got years ago. It was running NIM batteries, a brushed 23 turn super stock motor. I went from that to high-end modern-day buggy with LiPo power and a brushless motor and a very fast Savox servo. So I think electronics played a huge part in the performance gains. It wasn't all down to the buggy chassis, but nevertheless, acceleration, this thing flies from a dead stop. It flies off the line. The front end doesn't lift at all. I was watching someone drive a Tomahawk around the circuit, and it was very familiar. As soon as he tried to go anywhere into the gas, the front end wanted to lift up, because the front end on Tomahawk is just so light, and he was always struggling to keep all four wheels on the ground. The Yokomo, no matter how much you punch it off the line, it doesn't get light at the front, it just stays flat. So acceleration, particularly like mid-range acceleration, you can come around the corner at a moderate speed, pull the trigger, and it just accelerates way quicker, and I think that's mostly just due to the available power from the LiPo batteries. Next standout was cornering. Steering response is quick, but not overly so. Turning is great. The Yokomo has no understeer whatsoever and no oversteer. I didn't traction roll once. It just corners flat. It doesn't roll. I could carry way more corner speed with the Yokomo than I ever could with the DTO2 MS. It just flies around. Now, when I first raced the DTO2 MS, I didn't have very good tires on it, but I did later change them to tires more suited to carpet tracks, and it helped a lot. But still, the cornering is night and day between the Yokomo and the Tamiya, night and day. The next big standout is just how easy it is to jump the Yokomo. It's so well balanced in the air, and you can control the pitch very easily with throttle and brake inputs. I mean, I always felt the DTO2 was one of my easiest buggies to jump, but it wasn't. I felt it personally anyway. I'm still a novice driver, but I always felt it wasn't that easy to control in the air, but it was overall it was easier to jump than a lot of my other buggies. The Yokomo is even easier. It just jumps how you want it to. A mistake I made with my DTO2 is always trying to jump as far and as high as the high-end buggy people, and invariably, even if I got the jump right, got the takeoff right, and got the pitch right, and landed, properly, the buggy just couldn't handle big jumps, and so it would always come crashing down, and the chassis would smash against the floor. And over repeated runs, things started breaking, suspension arms, and towards the end of its run, basically the whole back end of the DTO2 MS was about to split off. The Yokomo, on the other hand, it's hard to describe. It, no matter how high you jump, if you nail it right, it just comes down almost as if it's just gliding down back to the carpet. Next standout feature is brakes. Now, I don't know if the brakes are something to do with brushless motors or what, but with the DTO2 MS, the brakes were okay. You hit the brakes, but I mean, it's a two-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive buggy, so it brakes pretty well. But the Yokomo, on the other hand, you hit the brakes, this thing stops, and it stops quick. I think tires play a part, but perhaps somebody can put in the comments, maybe it's something to do with brushless motor technology, I don't know, but you hit the brakes and you stop really quickly. But I found I hardly ever needed to use the brakes with the Yokomo, and given the fact I've got a 13.5 turn motor in there, but I'm also using quite a small pinion. So a lot of times I didn't even need to use the brake. I can get around the circuit pretty much either just on throttle or coasting. I believe it's got a drag brake, so even when you're coasting, it's slowing you down. But yeah, I didn't really need to use the brakes, but when I did, yeah, they worked really well. Incidentally, coming down the main straight, I would say my DTO2 MS was actually quicker with the super stock motor. Actually quicker. It's completely just down to the small pinion I'm using on the Yokomo. But yeah, top end, I would say my DTO2 MS is quicker. The difference comes when you get to a corner. I'd have to scrub a lot of speed off on the DTO MS, because otherwise I'd either understeer and hit the barrier, or if I tried to steer too much, then it would just traction roll and wouldn't make it around the corner. Whereas the Yokomo, it would corner flat, and I could carry so much more corner speed. So that's the performance. Now, to answer the second question, would I recommend getting into high-end buggy racing? What's involved? That is by far the more tricky of the two questions to answer. Do I recommend getting into high-end buggy racing? Yes and no. It sounds like a cop-out, but hear me out here. On the second day, I took my Grasshopper 2 along to the circuit. And the reason being, I'm going to talk more about my circuit experience in a separate video, like I mentioned earlier, but the reason being, I noticed almost everybody would have two buggies. They'd have one high-end buggy, and they'd also bring along, for example, a Grasshopper, a DTO2, DTO3, Blitzerbeetle, you name it, they were bringing it. And the reason being that the way the circuit works, it's split into time slots. So for 15 minutes, high end can run, and then another 15 minutes, only lower end, lower spec, Tamiya, Kyosho re-releases can run. So you're never on the track at the same time, which I'll talk about more in a different video. But what that meant was most people were bringing two buggies, one to race when it was high end time, and one to race when it was Tamiya time. And I got talking to a couple of people, and it became really obvious that everyone was having just as much fun in going around the track with their grasshopper as they were with their high-end buggies. In fact, at one point, I'd seen the circuit manager race a couple of times during the 2 days I was there, and not once did he pull out any of his high-end buggies. He was constantly racing his well, it was I believe a DTO2 at some point, but he's basically built a custom chassis, mounted the gearbox on backwards, so it's actually, the motor is now in the middle, and then it's got a what is it, a Kumamon buggy body on it, and he was constantly racing that. My point being that I noticed that on the first day, so the second day I took my Grasshopper 2, and I had so much fun just running that Grasshopper 2 round. I mean, the speeds was very sedate in comparison, but it was just as much fun as it was running around with the Yokomo. So my point is, you don't need high end to go to a circuit and have a good time. You can have a good time with whatever you bring, and as long as you drive within the buggy's limits, you're not going to break that many things. And also, I mean, it depends on the circuit as well, but yeah, if you drive sensibly with the buggy you have, you're not going to break a lot of things. So do you need to go to high end? Well, I think if you're used to running Tamiyas or Kyoshos and you want to go to high end, then it makes sense, but there are a few things you need to be aware of. For me, my foray into high end has been a lot more expensive than I think most people would find, simply because I needed to update all of my electronics. As you know, up until picking up the Yokomo, I had no LiPo batteries. Everything I ran was brush motors and nickel metal hydride impacts, so I needed to spend a lot of money on support electronics. I didn't have a high-end servo, which you absolutely need in a high-end buggy. I did not have a brushless motor, so I needed to pick one of those up. I did not have a mid to high spec brushless ESC to take advantage of that motor. And again, although I did have a battery charger that was suitable for LiPo batteries, I felt it was a little counterintuitive and hard for me to understand, so I ended up picking up another battery charger that I felt more comfortable using, especially being a novice to the world of LiPo batteries and wanting to make sure I didn't mess anything up. So for me, just getting set up was quite expensive when you factor in the cost of all the electronics needed, and then the cost of the buggy, etc., and wheels and tires. So yeah, the initial cost was quite high, and then of course once you get to the circuit, you quickly notice that everyone is using certain things, and you start talking to them, and suddenly you get gripped by gas, gear acquisition syndrome. It's something that's thrown around a lot in photographic circles, and something I tended to suffer from in the past. Yeah, you see other people using these things, and you ask them why they use it, and you're like, oh, that's good, I think I need one of those as well. And before you know it, you're spending more and more money on setup boards and height gauges and all kinds of bits and pieces. My point is, getting into high-end buggy racing can be expensive, and it can be expensive as you want it to be, I suppose. You could get, if you already had to hand the LiPo batteries and the brushless motor and ESC and a decent servo, then it wouldn't be much more than the cost of the buggy itself. But if you're coming from a complete fresh start with none of the support electronics, then yeah, it's quite expensive. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you can afford it and it's something you really want to do, go for it, get a high-end buggy and start racing. But at the end of the day, you don't need a high-end buggy to enjoy racing at a track. You can have just as much fun with a simple grasshopper. Well, those are my thoughts on getting into high-end buggy racing. I hope you found this video useful, and once again, apologies for waffling on for what seems like an eternity. Anyway, my name is David, you've been watching Kai City RC, and I will catch you in the next one.